Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, whatever time zone you're living in, it's time for Sumud. All about humanity, so this right here for everyone. Uplift, amplify, empower everyone. Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, whatever time zone you're living in, it's time for Sumud.
On this episode of the Sumud podcast, we uplift, empower, and amplify internationally recognized psychoanalytic therapist and author, Dr. Lara Sheehi. She's an assistant professor of clinical psychology at the Doha Institute for Graduate Studies, Qatar, and a research fellow at the University of South Africa's Institute for Social and Health Sciences. She is also the founding faculty director of the Psychoanalysis and the Arab World Lab.
We are your hosts, Hasan and Zaina Ashrawi. Don't forget to subscribe to the podcast wherever you watch or listen, and follow us on social media, either at Sumud Pod or at Sumud Podcast. Welcome, Lara. It's so wonderful to have you with us.
Yeah, shukran. Thank you so much for having me. I appreciate it.
Last time I saw you, actually, we were on a webinar almost exactly a year ago to the day. It was November 15th, and that was a, unbelievable time, beginning of the genocide. So it's really, really lovely having you here, and we have so much to talk about.
I also want to add that I was at dinner with a colleague the other day who works at the same university as your husband. And he was like, you really have to have them on. You really do. And I'm like, sure, that's a good idea. I'll see if I can make that happen. Of course, I didn't reveal it at that time, but just want to let you know, a lot of people, he listens to this quite often, so he's going to be surprised. So welcome again.
Thank you.
And Zaina, do you want to go with the first question?
Yeah, sure. I mean, we would love to know about your childhood, where, we know you're Lebanese. Tell us more about that. Where did you grow up? Where are you now? Just a little bit of your history, really, your childhood.
Yeah, thank you. You're the first podcast that ever asks that, which is really wonderful. And I was joking that, like, as a therapist, we're used to asking these questions. So I'm really happy to have kind of the table switched on me. So yes, أنا لبنانية من متن الأعلى. So from mountains in Lebanon, from a tiny little hamlet called Al-Qal'a, which means fortress. And when I say tiny, I mean tiny. There's like 3 families and of course different households within that family, but 3 last names. And this in Lebanon, that means something to come from a place like that. But grew up there. My parents are both from the same town, different families, but same town. And yeah, they met in the town. And the way that my grandparents' homes are positioned is that my mom's home is kind of higher up on the hill. And if she goes out on her terrace, she can see my parents' home. And that's my ancestral home. So very close, super close knit. It's Druze village. And so I think I was born into a Druze home, which means something only in as much as it positions me, I think, against Zionist Druze. And just to sort of note immediately that those are not the only Druze that exist. And in fact, most of us in Lebanon actually have an antagonistic relationship to the stronghold that Druze of Palestine, the ones that are collaborators, position themselves. And so I don't think I knew any of that, obviously, growing up, because it's a homogenous place, right? One thing I remember very early on is growing up in a very pro-Palestinian home. And I think for me, that's been really important. I was born during the Lebanese Civil War, and something I don't talk about very much, primarily because of the way that we are asked as colonized people and people who are under the brunt of imperial violence to always trot out our quote unquote traumas, or what people want to look at as our traumas. They will name them for us. So I don't often talk about this. I have certainly, particularly since the start of the genocide, just to mark the condition that those of us who were born or raised in Lebanon and in Palestine, the condition we share, which is the settler colonial condition of Zionism and imperialism more broadly. But I was born during the Civil War, and the first 5 years of my life were in and out of a bomb shelter, because our mountains where we were, that time frame of the Civil War, that area was very severely hit. And so much of it was going back and forth. We had a bomb shelter underneath our house, and much of it was going back and forth. Maybe with what happens with children's minds is that there's a kind of reconfiguration of what that time looks like. And all I could remember was, feeling really happy to be in a small space with my family and playing with my brother. And the bomb shelter was kind of built into the mountain. And so inside, you had these configurations of rocks, and my brother and I would hide all of our toys inside of them. And in periods of time when the bombing had kind of subsided just for a little bit, my brother's friend would also come over. And so largely speaking, what I remember is like the coziness of this, which I'm saying because when I went to graduate school to study psychology, I went to therapy for the first time. And my therapist, who was white and sort of misattuned the entire region, could not wrap her mind around the fact that this was not traumatic for me, that I was not immediately coding this as trauma. Now, I don't mean to say that my experience in childhood hasn't affected me or oriented me to the world. But by the time I was in graduate school, I was like, if it's oriented me to the world, it's oriented me towards justice and towards the condition that created the need for my parents to be in a bomb shelter, not the fact that I individually was traumatized. And I think that started to be the place where I was like, oh, there's something really interesting happening here in psychology where you can't fathom that somebody who lives in a war condition might generate something or not be identified or feel like that's the only thing that represents me is that trauma. So the other thing that I'll say about that is one of the most harrowing recognitions or realizations I have had during the past year of genocide. And I suppose this is what happens when free association happens. You ask about childhood and then your mind goes everywhere, right? Is that, we were in and out of a bomb shelter, and that's what allowed us to potentially live. We immigrated to Canada, my family and I, in 1990, in August 1990, when the Civil War ended that month. So everybody laughs. They're like, what the hell? Your family stayed there? Of course, the paper started before, but I'm saying this because my dad was trying to hold out and not leave, and his brother lived in Canada already. And what made him change his mind was after a month of heavy, heavy, heavy bombing, where we spent an entire month in the bomb shelter, there was kind of a lull in the bombing. And my parents said, we need to get these kids out of here and let them breathe some fresh air. And so my mom took us to a neighbor, a family friend and neighbor. And as soon as we'd got there, which is like less than a mile away from the house, as soon as we got there, the bombing started and actually was so nearby that somebody inside the building we were going to died, and we didn't outside. And my brother, who's older than me, he's 5 years older than me, remembers seeing shrapnel falling and my grandmother hugging us. I have no memory of this. I was 4 years old. I have no memory of this, which is interesting in and of itself. But my dad was still at home and saw the smoke coming out of that exact place and was so terrified. He made the decision that he was like, that's it. I can't hold out any longer, and submitted the paperwork for immigration, and his brother helped with that. And so the harrowing recognition that I was telling you about was we survived because we had a bomb shelter. And then I think about the warfare that's happening right now, where bomb shelters are not meant to save people anymore. Like they can't be used for that purpose anymore. And it might seem like such a simple recognition, but when that hit me, I was like, oh my gosh, they're going so far down into the ground that people can't even use bomb shelters for what they're made for. And that feels that just blew something up inside of me in terms of the targeted nature of this. So that's my childhood. We left when I was 5 to the settler state of Canada. Went from a hamlet to 1,000 population town. So I'm like, I'm just gonna go back and be like, what were my parents thinking here? 99% white, very racist prairie land. This was indigenous land that, of course, was not referred to as that. And I think there immediately I was aware of like how people spoke about indigenous folks, the stereotypes. It was so saturated, and of course the racism towards us as one of two Arab families. Even back then, tropes about terrorism and certainly anti-Black racism mobilized against us, and And then also stereotypes of wealth and all those sorts of things. My parents owned a restaurant, like many immigrants do. And then people ask, oh, so did you make good hummus there? I'm like, no, my parents are like one of the few Lebanese immigrants that went and opened up a diner. They opened up a diner. Well, or they joined his brother in this diner. So we had these old school, like baskets and big burgers with the, the sesame seeds on top and all of that. And my parents, thankfully, and this is the best thing they ever did for us, we're probably the only immigrants that said we're leaving for 7 years and actually only stayed for 7 years and made the decision to move us back. I was 12 years old when I moved back to Lebanon. So I say that's the best thing they did for us, because I can see now what living in the diaspora and not having the groundedness of being bibledna and really connecting to what it means. I had lost Arabic already, and I have a memory of knowing the words inside my head and struggling so much to articulate them when I went back, and felt like this is the most frustrating experience ever, to relearn a language that's natively yours. And so that also, I think now I can look in retrospect and go, oh, okay, that marked the political importance of Arabic for me and what it meant that it was stolen from me, despite the fact that my dad had like the Arabic books and he would try to teach us. And like in many ways, there are things that are coercively stolen from us when we leave Bledna. And so went to high school there, and then ended up going as doing my bachelor's degree in English literature at the American University of Beirut, which was where I was politically radicalized. And that feels like such an important part of my life. I was there during the invasion of Iraq. I joined organizing circles, did all of that. And that's where I learned the responsibility of wearing a hatta and what it means. What do we commit to as Lebanese when we say the kafiyya is a symbol of liberation for all of our countries? And I think that's my life in a nutshell from my perspective. But anything you want to poke at, I'm game.
I actually have a question that only you can answer,
Yeah.
given your profession. You said you don't remember the
Yes.
shrapnel in Lebanon, but that doesn't mean it didn't impact you.
Right. That's
Right?
right.
Right. So what impact do you think it could have had, even though you don't remember?
Yeah. That's a really good question. I have excavated this for a long time, and including in therapy, where like, are there things that are hidden that hasn't impacted me? The only thing I can land on is it's arbitrary in terms of who it lodges itself into in particular ways and who it doesn't. Maybe my repressive skills actually saved me. I don't know, from being that impacted by that. And I say this because I was there in 2006 and we were evacuated in 2006. And that's the year I started graduate school, which is a whole other story of leaving Lebanon on a ship, evacuated, asking us to take 10 kilos of our stuff and deciding what to do. And, being under the drones and everything. And even then, I don't remember having like flashbacks or remembering or in my body thinking this is familiar to me. The one thing that I will say to you, what does it mean? How has it impacted me? Is maybe there are ways that I bypass things and focus on what's generative about it. And again, I don't want to say there's anything determinative about why that's the case. My brother has a lot more memories. Part of that might be age, but part of that is he was wired, let's say, a little more anxious than I was. The anxiety was never a thing that I remember having outwardly. The one thing I will say that I've never actually said to anybody, so this is a gem for you all, is I crack my knuckles a lot. This is something that people recognize about me. I mean, I could crack anything in my body. I have a memory of the first time ever cracking my ankles was in my crib in the bomb shelter. Like I can actually remember that, but I can't remember anything else. And I'll leave it to the analysts out there to be like, what does that mean? But yeah, I don't know. The last thing I'll share is that one of the things that therapist I was telling you about asked me, she was just like, my mom runs on the anxious side, and it's fine that I say that. She knows this. Even if she listens to this, she knows that that's kind of her jam. And she's extremely afraid of bombs and big noises and all of that. And so, and one time in therapy, my therapist was just like, "Oh, well, what was your mom doing during these times that this was happening?" And I was like, I don't remember. So right after therapy, I got on the phone with my mom and I was like, "Mama, ايش كنتِ تعملي بس ييجي القذايف? What did you do when they bombed?" And she'd be like, "You don't remember?" And I'm like, "No, what did you do?" She was like, "I would grab you and your brother and put us in a corner and scream." And I was like, "Okay, maybe that's why I don't remember." Maybe it was too overstimulating because it was just, she couldn't handle that level of activation. And so these are my hypotheses as to why my repression is so good in that regard. But maybe it also says something about, again, and I don't see this as pathological. To the contrary, I think it's helped me not fall into despair over time and just be like, I can recognize what is happening and then also focus on the generative elements of what's coming out of this. So
Wow. That's really powerful, because I think, we often think of ourselves ihna as us having to cope with trauma, but when we talk about our parents having to protect us, I mean, the level of trauma that they must have been experiencing and the fear for their own children. So that's probably both a coping mechanism for her and to protect you in some, instinctive way, I guess. Fascinating. Lara, one of the things in our culture in general, I think that we try to bring as much awareness to is the importance of mental health in general, right? And I feel that our community often makes that a taboo, right? Talk about our mental health. What is it? How can we, how do you feel like has it gotten better over time? Do you think people are more accepting of it? People are, does genocide, having to go through a genocide and understanding the importance of taking care of your mental health part of the I guess the work needed to get people into the mental health field, to talk to people about how they're feeling?
Yeah.
If you can please talk about that and the taboo in the Arab culture.
Sure, of course. Maybe I'll start with we don't own stigma or taboo, right? And I think that, and I don't say that to say it doesn't exist. I'm saying that because I would love for us to de-exclusivize that approach to things, partially because, I mean, we get to be the most focused on our communities because we're in our communities and we see how that might affect people or the ways in which people might have to hide what they're struggling with or change the way they talk about it. Or what we regularly hear is people somaticize instead of sort of emote, or whatever the case is. My concern in over focusing on that is that it makes it seem like somehow that's culturally determinative, that that's like biologically what we're wired to do as Arab or Muslims or just in the Arab region. And I'm saying that because I think by and large, mental health is a very stigmatized thing. And we can look at the context of the settler colony of the United States, and even in the most vanilla white, space, is that this is also not a, topic that is encouraged. People are punished when they're honest about what they're, like, socially punished when they're honest about their struggles. There's a lot of ableism that's involved in it. There's a lot of disciplining, especially around gender lines of like what it looks like. And so I suppose it's a larger question, and then how it manifests in our culture is maybe specific, right? And there are families just like anything else. And I don't, I think that's important because that's our starting point. Sometimes I hear people ask me about this and it feels to them as though it's so big, it's insurmountable. And that's why that starting point is actually really important for us, because if we can move away from the idea that somehow this is culturally determinative, then we can say, what are the ways in which this is a dynamic process? And then the entry points might be different for a variety of reasons, but that doesn't mean that there can't be movement done. So you just mentioned like the genocide, right? And the webinar you were talking about that at the beginning was one about mental health that was hosted through the ADC. And part of it was because so many folks across our lives, those of us who were involved in it, were really asking us, what do we do? We're feeling, a level of violent intrusion on our internal world. We can't concentrate. We can't sleep, we can't eat. There's all these. And so I do think that's the dynamism that we're talking about, is that there's a way in which our community is responding very actively, and I think actually very outwardly, to the things that are happening. And that's what I mean by entry point, is like, what are the maybe part of it, maybe part of the reason why our communities have not been gung-ho about mental health is because mainstream mental health and psychology doesn't speak, was not built for our communities, doesn't speak to our communities, over pathologizes our communities, misses the mark in terms of what's actually important for people, relies on a Eurocentric and white supremacist way of thinking about how families are constructed, how families live together, development. So if you're like, by and large, the messaging you're getting is, this is a way of thinking about the world that has nothing to do with your lived reality, there's a very healthy, rejection of it, or maybe even suspicion of it. And yes, does that tie into stigma? Sure. But I think, again, if we can be like, hey, maybe this is the problem of the field rather than our people, then we have an entry point. And that's what I think has shifted, certainly over the past decade, and then even more in the past year, is that when there are many of us that I think are mobilizing our work, or, what we can call our expertise or anything, to speak to the material realities that people are living in, to make it actually speak to them and speak to their particularities, and not lose the specificity of what they care about, and not prescribe Eurocentric modes of being as like being representative of the entire world, and like that's the only human there is. And that's why I think there has been a shift, right? The other thing that I'll say is, just anecdotally, is, and this is not to use representational politics in terms of just its emptiness. Like, we know, we just saw the catastrophe of an election that just happened. We know representation is not enough to do anything. But in terms of representation in the field of psychology over the past, I think, decade, certainly, but those who came before us that also built the infrastructure for us, is that there are now more and more and more people who speak Arabic, who know the specifics of our community, and who are dedicated to disrupting the hegemonic ways that our field insists on a white supremacist way of functioning, that also is speaking to people, right? And that's, I think, that's the shift we're seeing too, is that there are more and more and more of us that are just like, no, we're not going to, give up parts of our Arabness just in order to become legible or fit into this mainstream psychology. We're coming in and saying, it's not an adaptation either, because that's what they love. They're just like, let's adapt this and make it a hyphen. It's like, no, let's look at like, what are people actually struggling with? This is not the thing, right? And so I think just from the get-go, if folks are seeing somebody who they can, obviously we're not the same, we're not a homogenous group, but if they can say, I'll use myself as an example, if they're just like, this is somebody I don't have to educate or convince that the annexation and dispossession that happened in Palestine in 1948 actually ripples through my family and has something to do about the way that I'm oriented to the world and move through it now, then the starting point and the entry point can be much easier. And the rest of the stuff gets worked out. But if from the get-go, I'm sitting there being like, will this person ever understand? Will they prescribe me to move out of my family's house? I'm not making this stuff up. This is exactly the stuff that people have experienced, right? They're just like, oh, I'm having problems with my family. Well, why don't you move out? That's not a prescription for everybody, let alone the classist being classist. It's just like not an option for for most of the world, right? And so I think, again, just knowing that there are those of us out there that might have an attunement to the texture of our community also allows immediately for kind of some of the destigmatization, at least as an entry point,
How about the stigma within our community? And I'm going to give a real life example for me, right? So I can't remember which episode it was, but I talked about my mental health at times before, like depression and anxiety. And when the episode aired, how could you do that? You reveal too much about you. People are going to ask questions and
Yeah.
so what? That's the whole idea here. So how do we navigate that stigma within our own people?
Yeah. I mean, just exactly what you did is the normalizing of it. I think this is like, I always talk to my students, for example, that about contextualizing things and unpacking them in a historical arc, right? And if we can think about all things, including mental health, as being politicized, what is the function of, let's say, we're focusing on our community. What is the function of our community that is historically an immigrant community? Having this idea of like, keep things under wraps, don't tell people. There's a historical reality to that might be now overused, but it's still historically true that, when you're an immigrant, what you're trying to do, at least at that time, I think things have shifted again now, is assimilate, is not, you don't want to have people pay attention to you. You don't want to air your dirty laundry. You don't want your family is like, that's your people, and you got to protect your family even from like amme, right? Like we're each other's posse, and the family's all with each other, but in the end like those sorts of things also affect the way that we're talking about issues of like being honest about mental health. And then we can think about it more structurally about ableism in specific, and what does mental health mean, and issues of like weakness or vulnerability or quote unquote being crazy. Like, and that's what I mean also about we don't own that. I see that in every single part of society. It's not just our people, but I think what you did is great, is like normalize it, right? And talk about these things and maybe delink it from all the, I mean, I suppose we can't disrupt the meanings it has for other people. But what we can say is, this is actually a part of my life. And talking about it might be not just helpful to other people, but also helpful to you to just be like, this is a part of what I go through every single day, or a parts of my life. So why would that be something that I need to leave out of this story or feel shame about it or something like that? And I imagine that many of us actually are constantly battling that anyway. So it's not a quick fix, but it is, the more of us, again, like the representational thing that I was talking about, is that I think we need to insist on moving with the dynamic of like, and we're not reinventing anything. We know this has always been around, right? All of us have somebody in our family in the history of like, oh, this person was this, right? We all have those stories. So it's nothing new either.
Lara, one of the things, I mean, you just hit the nail on the head, and I'm thinking as you're talking in the larger context, also in the smaller context, and from K through 12, like one of the things that we're dealing with now is trying to help these kids in the United States deal with the trauma that they're going through generally as it relates to genocide, بفلسطين وبلبنان وباليمن وبالعراق وبسوريا, and these kids are having to live lives, one where they're worried about who they are as people or their own existence, but also their friends here have a complete disconnect from what's happening. So that's one sort of experience that they're facing. But then when we ask the school system to help them, they say, well, we provide mental health resources, right? And I think it's really important that you mentioned it right now, and you talk about it extensively in your larger work, which is being able to understand these kids from a context where they're coming from, not just to slap a label on it of addressing mental health. How do you think, what approach should we as advocates and activists, particularly for K through 12 and even in college, because that is where it's very central to what we're going through right now. How do you think it's best for us to advocate for mental health in those spaces? Do we have the resources? Do we have the ability to share those?
Yeah. For me, as you're talking about that, I feel like this fits into the larger question of divestment. And it's not just like divestment as in BDS, but divestment from, I mean, maybe this is what this entire year has done for us, is just shatter any sort of sense, any little inkling that was left in any of us about any of these organizations or institutions being able to address or attune to the things we actually might need from them. And I actually think that's a good thing, right? It's for us to say, because when we recognize their limitations constitutively, not because of accidental, right? I think sometimes it's just like, oh, but they're attending to other people's needs and not our. And it's like, that might be the case, but that's still constitutive. Like they're not meant to attend to these things in the way we might need them to. What that does is redirect, I think, our energy into spaces of like community spaces and community generated spaces that better address the needs of our community in ways that organizations can never do. Because organizations and institutions, whether they're schools or all of that, are always going to compromise. Like as part of their thing, they not only will they compromise, but they will ask you or the kids to compromise before, as a precondition to anything. You're just like, sure, I'm going to help you with your mental health, but these are the things that are off limits to talk about, right? Or like, let's keep the politics out of it. Let's just talk about this. Or God forbid, because we also have to localize this in terms of the United States, is that this is a surveillance state. And surveillance is not divvied up equally. And so there's also a way in which psychologists and clinicians in general have worked alongside the state. We have documented research about this, like documentation, have worked alongside the state to surveil our communities at a higher rate. And so for me, I'd be like divesting from that, because those spaces will always be carceral spaces. They will always be spaces of discipline for our kids. They will always be spaces that ask our kids to disidentify from their communities and from the people who are fighting for their liberation, again, before they engage in anything. So our job, I think, is recognizing that, number one, divesting ourselves and being like, so where's our energy going? Is it to community spaces? Is it to organizations in which our kids can be fortified? And even in terms of like normalizing this conversation and learning together how one navigates, like through peer support, how one navigates these conversations and navigates what we might call code switching. You're talking about living two different lives, like code switching, which our generations might have done that. I feel like they're doing that at such a higher rate too, because there's this way in which the code switching is now about political affiliations as well. And what am I able to say here? What am I not? This is a safe, there's all these considerations they have to do that have actually bigger implications as well. And so what does it mean to create spaces, not of safety, because I think that's also the wrong messaging. I think when we talk about quote unquote safe spaces, we might inadvertently create the fantasy that somehow the structure can create a space of safety, pure safety. And safety always relies on the subjugation of somebody else, that type of pure safety. So instead, it's sort of like, how do we create solidarity, kinship networks, support where, if this is not being attended to here, that you're also not feeling isolated and on your own and alienated and like you have to do that by yourself, whether that's the kid or their families, right? And that's kind of a response back to also maybe the history of the diaspora, the Arab American diaspora in general, or just diaspora across the board, not just in the settler colony of the United States, is, and I think this is something that I spoke about, the mental health thing, is like divest from whiteness too, entirely. Like we need to, as Arabs, it's time, it's a long time. It's been a long time. I'm so proud of us. We've been doing it. We're just like, oh, guess what? That shit doesn't work. All the promises, white supremacy turns out to be a load of shit. And what it means is subjugating ourselves and other people, and mainly Indigenous and Black folks in this settler colony. And so I think when we give up on those divestment, like I said, we can then say, who are we making community with? And what are the fights that we're fighting? And I think it becomes even more urgent as we're seeing, this empire fall and crumble in front of our eyes.
So I want to talk about your approach to therapy, but I got to ask this question, and this is a compliment to you,
Yes.
okay? What kind of patient were you? Because if I'm that white therapist you talked about, I'm like, oh shit, what's going on here? I mean, how did you navigate? Did you know like right away that, this person doesn't know what they're talking about and I'm going to do something different?
Yeah. I love that question so much. Thank you for the compliment. For the that I'm antagonistic to whiteness is a good compliment. It's a great question. I don't think I felt it always, but I didn't have the words for it. And it's actually these experiences over and over and over and over again that made me hone the way that I think about it, because I would always walk out of there feeling something. Later on, I could think about as misattunement, coercion sometimes, because when people have a specific idea of what you should look like, there are ways that they subtly coerce you into talking even about those things, where I'm just like, that's not what I'm talking about. I'll give you a specific example from my therapy. I came to the United States under duress, under conditions of being evacuated. But I also knew then, this is one thing I did know, is that I had the privilege of having a passport to a settler colony that allowed me the freedom of movement. I had certain class benefits that would allow me to later take on a great deal of loans to have graduate education, right? My family came with me. I didn't have to leave my parents in Lebanon. So all those things, to me, felt a buffer. How am I sitting there gonna, be traumatized by something that effectively took me to the place where I was already planning to go? So it never computed for me in that regard. So I came in and she would constantly ask me about that. And what I really was struggling with, and this is the part I wish she had focused on, which is why this is the part I would always feel. I'd come in and I'd talk about the racial aggressions I was feeling and how I constantly was made out to be the aggressive person in my graduate program, about how for the first time in my life, I was surrounded by Zionists. For the first time in my life, I had Israelis in my class, and Israelis that came from settlements. It wasn't just all Israelis are settlers, but there's this particular type of Israeli sort of configuration when you're coming from a settlement, right? And that's the stuff that I was like, and then learning the racial codes of the United States, where I was coming in and I'm like, oh, the history of Arabs in this country in terms of I had to learn all of that. I was 21 years old. I didn't have any family here. I was doing all of that and navigating how you get a fucking social security card and phone and all this stuff. And that's the stuff that was complicated by issues of gender and race. And she was not equipped for that. Instead, she would always focus on, well, what about the bombs? And I'm just like, this shit is way harder. The racism, the anti-Arab racism and the weird thing was how white people would get so aggressive when they were like, why aren't you siding with whiteness? I came in primed because I was politicized to be like, brown folks and black folks are my people. And white folks would get so angry. And I had to learn all of that. And so in therapy, she was not equipped to do that. But I really did, to answer your question more directly, I really did try. I thought it was me. I thought because the messages I was getting was, you're too much, or you're too political, or you make everything about race. And so here I was in therapy being like, is this just me? Am I missing something here? Is there something that I'm not getting? Maybe it is me. Maybe it is all of that. And at the same time, remember, I was a trainee. So I was being disciplined into a very particular type of therapy that would position me as oppositional or resistant. It's those experiences that allowed me to hone a language of critique against oppressive types of therapies that made people make themselves legible to a particular type of therapist under the violent guise of neutrality. These people wanted me to believe this was a neutral ask. The neutral ask was to make the Arab woman silent. That's a neutral ask, right? in a room where I was being aggressed upon constantly, and my body and everything in me was telling me there's something seriously fucked up happening here. And I'm reading these codes and I'm trying to find words for them. And the therapist just, is always deflecting and like thinking it's something else, or thinking this is a stand-in for something else, or a defense against something that was entirely irrelevant to me, you know? So I think the antagonism came later, which is maybe for many of us, because I really did, I for a moment there, I was being disciplined in the same way.
Hey, Zaina, do you know how we had to boycott mainstream soda brands? Well, now there's an alternative, and Palestine is in the name. Sumud Podcast is excited to be sponsored by Palestine Drink Shop, the nation's leading importer of Palestine Cola, which is proud to be a partner with Palestine Drinks, a brand making waves in the beverage industry.
Absolutely, Ed. In fact, three brothers of Palestinian descent based in Sweden were inspired by the growing demand for an alternative to mainstream soda brands, founded Palestine Drinks. Rooted in social responsibility, the company operates under its parent brand, Safad Foods AB. It donates 100% of its profits to support Palestinian civil society organizations or efforts.
If you'd like to show your support, please visit PalestineDrinkShop.com to pre-order Palestine Cola. Be sure to also follow them on Instagram at PalestineDrinks_shop for updates on new flavor releases and exciting giveaways.
We at Sumud Podcast are thrilled to have Visualizing Palestine as a sponsor. Visualizing Palestine creates free and accessible research-based visual tools that are utilized by educators, students, and organizers who want to provoke narrative change and raise awareness about the roots of injustice in Palestine. In fact, we are both members of Visualizing Palestine, and I personally have used Visualizing Palestine's resources and visuals as an organizer and activist in reports, presentations, and even at events.
Community support is the heart of Visualizing Palestine's work. Your recurring membership helps ensure they can thrive and continue making an impact. Join us today and be part of this important mission.
So to access the free downloadable visuals and for more information, please visit visualizingpalestine.org and follow Visualizing Palestine on Instagram at visualizing_Palestine.
So it is gaslighting a form of therapy or a part of
Oh, yes,
therapy?
it can be. That's a great question. Yes, absolutely. It can be, which is what I suppose I would say as disciplining into normativity, right? Where like, especially the conditions, especially if you're telling somebody under conditions of oppression that somehow the problem is localized within them. I'm not saying that sometimes we don't have dynamics that complicate things, but by and large, to say that it's my responsibility to find ways to patch myself up, to adapt to incredibly racist society that was like 3 years out of post 9/11, by the way, right? So that is unconscionable to me to say, but that is the gaslighting therapy.
Is that a thing? Is that actually a thing? Like a
No, you just
phrasing?
made
Or
that up.
there we go. So we just
It's great.
We should coin that from
Yeah.
now on. So podcast for biographies and coining terms. No, this is awesome. So a little bit, Yani, we're talking about the differences in psychology and how we treat different patients or how we treat, but even patients.
Yes.
Let's not talk about patients, we'll talk about people, right? And one of the things that in psychoanalysis under occupation, you describe that psychoanalysis techniques are distinct in the Palestinian way. Like there's a distinct Palestinian way that people in your work that you see that is used to talk about the Palestinian trauma and Palestinian experience.
Yes.
You
Sure. Let me say that part of the distinctness is that's just the field of, my study, and so I don't mean to overgeneralize and say that's the only way that it's described. But it's certainly the field where both Stephen and myself, so we co-authored the book, that was our mode of focus. And so we really were meeting with psychoanalytic clinicians precisely because of the experiences that both of us had, and certainly me being trained within there about like a particular flavor of this in psychoanalysis. And here's why I come down hard on psychoanalysis is, number one, I'm trained within the field, and so I have a particular ethical imperative to actually be responsible for the harm that's done in the name of the field, because I'm a representative of it just by way of my training. But also because being in the field, psychoanalysis professes itself as a theory to be one in which that's interested in conscious and unconscious processes, that is able to talk about the ways in which people's behavior is contradictory, in which the social world animates our internal world, in which power is always at play, desire, all these sorts of things. And then I had these experiences of like being in conferences or talking to people in the field. And the second that Palestine is mentioned, everything shuts down, which was fascinating to me. I was like, what is happening here that you can't reach into your own, this beloved field that you love, and that you bash people over the head with about like, you should be able to handle this and you should be able to maintain your neutrality because you are psychoanalytically oriented. But the second you said Palestine, shit just went off the rails. And so there was something really, that's the distinctness of psychoanalysis. So when we started to sort of do research and sort of dig into it a little bit more too, there's something that emerged also about the ways in which very early on psychoanalytic projects or institutions were working hand in hand with the Zionist state coming into being, right? With the infrastructure, which might make sense because at that time, that's the sort of theoretical framework that's the most, prominent, and also is a commentary on how psychology works hand in hand with the state always, and has always worked hand in hand with the state. So whatever its primary theoretical framework is, at that point, it's psychoanalysis. It's working hand in hand with a settler colonial and a colonial entity in terms of its state-making efforts. And so for us to think about how can we talk about Palestine and mental health and psychoanalysis without talking about the ways in which it is deeply imbricated and tied into the asphyxiatory regime of the settler colony, and the ways in which Palestinians and Palestinian life and Palestinian psyche and Palestinian movement is circumscribed by that approach. Because the example being, if you are a Zionist Israeli supervisor and you're supervising a Palestinian therapist in Al-Quds, let's say, or Haifa or anywhere, how do we imagine that your approach is not going to carry with it all the fucked up things we know Zionists think about Palestinians, and we've been seeing, broadcast on TikToks for the past, year. And certainly we don't need the TikToks to tell us. We know Palestinians have been telling us, those of us in the region have been telling everybody what that looks like. But I'm using it as a shorthand because that's something everybody now sees. Like, that's the crisis of Zionism now, is like, oh shit, this is who we are, right? So that's the distinctness of it. And I think we really wanted to hone in and say, on the one hand, this has been used as alongside a project of state building, that it's an ethno-nationalist settler colonial state building. And how does that seep into clinical work and supervision? On the other hand, and what's more, life-giving, is looking at the ways in which psychoanalytic clinicians who are in Palestine, who are Palestinian, use the theory and mobilize it to create life for themselves and for their patients, which is far more of a fascinating narrative than the violence of Zionism, right? Like, the violence of Zionism is one we know. The narrative and the lives and the beautiful depth of these clinicians who've been practicing is one that's always written out of the story, because the story of psychoanalysis is not a story of psychoanalysis happening in Palestine. It's the story of a Eurocentric psychoanalysis that always has, whiteness sort of written all over it. And people are shocked. They're like, wait, there are psychoanalysts in Palestine? I'm like, yeah. And they've been there for a long time. And our majallet have talked about psychoanalysis for ages. And people have taken up these questions of psyche and breath and soul, benafs, what we call it, nafs. These things have a long, rich history. And so for us, it was about, how do we uplift what's already there? We're not saviors. We're not people coming in being like, oh, look at us, we're such great researchers, we are showing. It's like, no, we're coming in alongside our comrades on the ground and saying, you're always written out of this history, And what is it that you're actually doing here, right? And, Edward Said has a book about psychoanalysis specifically for that. And I think it's just one of the things that he says, and there's his paraphrase, is like, Freud didn't think that he might have Arab readers, but he did, and he does, right? Because it's just like, yeah, if we're thinking about why wouldn't we? And then you can sort of see the racist fantasies about what our people constitute and are. Like somehow we're so out of the range of this world that psychoanalysis wouldn't be used or thought about or mobilized in ways that are also indigenous to us.
So Zaina, we got a problem because this whole conversation is like one big clip for us. So I don't know how we're going to pick and choose.
Yeah.
What is the right clip here?
I know. Yeah, that's going to be interesting. As you're talking, I'm thinking, okay, this is 1, this is 2. That's unbelievable. It's just, you're amazing for both the power in your words and your work. It's just, empowering to hear you speak.
Thank you.
And so to continue that a little bit further, to take it further, sort of the psychoanalysis in Palestine and the Palestine way, if you will, you also discuss sort of the psychological warfare, basically, that is used, but it's also physical. There's 2 different ways that they have used that against the Palestinians in particular, but sort of the colonial project as a whole has used for centuries, I guess. Do you want to talk a little bit more about the psychological warfare and the physical?
Yes, sure. Yeah, I think we can think about let's start with the structure of Zionism, like constitutively, and then we can move to a far more interesting thing of how Palestinians have always resisted that. Is constitutively, Zionism is supposed to extend its sovereignty. It's land grabbing. It's about, and we're seeing this concretely today, whether it's to Lebanon or just across, historic Palestine. And so the psyche has always been a part of that project, but because it has to be, like, I say this, and of course Zionists will come after me and be like, you are, picking out Zion. I'm just like, no, you don't even know your own ideological position. Like, if you're a settler and you have an ideological position that is one about racial supremacy and expansionism, why wouldn't the psyche be a part of that? Like, that's precisely what you're trying to do, is have people discipline themselves and start to feel like the colonizer lives inside of them, right? That's the intent. The intent is harm. The intent is to isolate, to atomize, to do all these sorts of things, to break communal bonds, because the best way to sort of settle a place that happens to be habitated by indigenous people is also to disconnect them, and disconnecting them also has psychic arms to it, right? So one of the ways in which this is done, of course, is terrorize. I mean, that's the easiest way we can think about, right? Is terrorize people. Nadira Shalhoub-Kavrukian and Stephanie Wahab have a great article about kind of the necropower Zionism, and what they specifically talk about is like the use of secret information, particularly against women. And this is particularly also in Quds, right? Where the state can just be like, we have secret information about you. Now, all of us don't have to work very hard to know what the innuendo is about secret information and why that would be necessary. But if you just say that to somebody, that's psychological terrorizing. That's making them afraid to do anything. That's stopping them in their tracks. They doubt themselves. They have to like sort of constantly, even if they've done nothing, the whole point, and this is where Frantz Fanon helps us, is like the colonized is always presumed guilty by the colonizer, and you make them feel that all the time. So that's one example of it. The other part is how everyday life is circumscribed by the arbitrary power and sometimes very targeted power of the state, which could mean anything from movement, right? Or how long it takes for you to get to a therapy session, by the way. So we talked to clinicians, for example, who said sometimes if there's a flying checkpoint, even if something's in like, if somebody's in Shafat, there's a clinic in Shafat, right? And somebody might live somewhere very near that, and it might take them 2 hours to get there. So even having to rewire like what a 24 hours looks like psychologically for Palestinian versus for somebody else, there's a psychological wear and tear that comes with that. Having to consider constantly what might happen. What are the considerations I have to do for the day just to make my day go? That's not even commenting on the ways in which people are worried about their children, for example, just walking to school. The basic things that most people don't have to think about are things that are circumscribed, potentially could be circumscribed by violence. And that's the psychic intrusion part. The physical part kind of matches that, is that your body autonomy, right, is meant to make you feel that your body autonomy is not yours. And I said meant to make you feel because Palestinians show us the way about willful defiance, about saying, you think you own me, خليني فرجيكم. You think you own me, right? So I have like a clinician friend of ours that shared a example from a patient of hers where he was at the checkpoint and they were searching his pockets and he dropped a coin. And of course, the sadistic psychological warfare and physical warfare that happened at the same time is the IOF settler soldier want to force him to get down on his knees and pick up the coin. And he ended up being incarcerated because he was just like, fuck you, no. And it might seem so small. And I've heard people, I was at this meeting when she gave this example and somebody was like, well, why didn't he just pick up the coin? Then he would have not gone to jail. And apart from like missing the point about dignity and karami and being able to, it's also like, that is a confessional about what kind of world you live in, that you think that if he followed orders, this would end a different way. But Palestinians know that no matter how much you bend to the will of the settler, that's the point of the psychological and physical warfare, is like, you could just as well decide, I get down on my knees and pick up this thing and make you feel better, you sadistic asshole. But in the end, I'm still incarcerated because we're not in the same playing field here, right? And in those examples, I've already kind of segued into the beauty of psychic resistance. And much of this does come from Palestinian political prisoners. And I will say also, by and large, political prisoners that are fighting for the liberation of Palestine and the Bled al-Arabi more broadly, because we know that we have many political prisoners that aren't just Palestinian, right? But who fight for the cause. And it's sort of like creating, possibilities from situations where it doesn't look like there are any possibilities. And that's the psychic resistance that we're seeing. Sumud, of course, is a part of that. Shout out to your podcast name. But also, like, I'm reminded just about like Walid Daqqa and his writing, where he was just like, I'm writing to bypass these walls, to bypass the realities that they've created for me. And he specifically says, does not mean I'm dissociating. It doesn't mean that I'm making something up. It means that I refuse to have these people dictate what possibilities exist in my mind and in the future and in reality, which then actually got enacted when we saw 6 prisoners break free, right? Using spoons. Like, nobody, this is the thing. If Palestinian bi'almuna, they teach us that just like this shit that you think is just for food, look at the thing it can do. Just like when we saw the bulldozer transform into a symbol of liberation, right? The thing that demolishes everything, that's supposed to be a symbol of destruction, all of a sudden is just like, the siege in Gaza is coming down, and we're going to use this same thing. And I'm not being Pollyannish when I say that these are concrete examples over and over and over and over again about how there's an intent to intrude on the psychic space, because that's the space of collapse. And there's more so a willful defiance, a refusal to let Palestinian life and Lebanese life and all of our lives be dictated by the violence of the settler.
You talk about Sumud, and I think in some of your writing or maybe talks that you've given, you talk about nefs comes together with Sumud and the Eurocentric attempt to basically separate them, right? Do you still see that quite a bit in your practice?
Yeah. And partially because, so let me just sort of, nefs, the separation part is our concept of nefs, bibledna, or just in general, and this is not to romanticize, it's just like, these are concepts that exist and have long existed, and there are things that are sort of worked on. Certainly there's a religious component to that too, which I think is really important not to sidestep, because mainstream or sort of Eurocentric psychology is meant to go more on the scientific side. And so spiritualism and religiosity are always left out of that, where it's just like, maybe that's a central component of what makes a human. So we have to pay attention to that. But this concept of nefes is like, means a lot of things. It's psyche, breath, self, soul. And that idea that what makes a person is a complex, constellation of all these things together, not one of these things. If we're talking about nefes, we're talking about psyche, we're talking about soul, we're talking about self, and we're talking about breathing, right? And that reminder of how people are multidimensional is precisely what moves against or is antagonism with this hyper individualistic idea of the person as only the brain or a thought or a behavior. Because when we're talking about all these modes of this, then we're just like, oh, this person also then exists within a dynamic of nufus, right, around them. Like this, there's a cultural and social dynamic that's involved in that too. And I think the why Sumud and that works together is because Sumud is a political practice, and it's an insistence on a commitment to the reality that Palestine will be free, irrespective of what the conditions are telling us or what the conditions insist on and what oppression insists on. And central to that is one's ability to remain clear on the intent to break somebody. This is why, studies of Sumud, obviously we're not the first people to say this, to come out of prison literature, because there's a recognition that like everything they do to us is meant to cut us off from Palestine, is meant to cut us off from the land, is meant to cut us off from our community, and is meant to make us believe that everybody's forgotten about us, right? And that idea, if we're thinking about psyche, soul, breath, self, there was a way in which Sumud also respects all of those things, because you need all of those things to retain your clarity in the face of, torture and oppressive conditions that kind of defy comprehensibility.
How do you make sure that all of what you just said is implemented in psychology books or added?
It doesn't belong there. They don't deserve it. Psychology books don't deserve it. But it's true, because you know why? I partly that's tongue in cheek, but it's not, because my concern is that once it becomes packaged in a textbook, it becomes manualized in a particular way and appropriated, and it misses it's meant to be sanitized and depoliticized. And Sumud is political. It's a political concept, and no textbook is going to hold that. And certainly white people aren't going to be recreating Sumud in the classroom.
Medical choking sensation, I think it
Yes.
was. Can you share that story a little bit?
Yeah, sure. Yeah. And Stephen and I, when we talk about our book, this is the case that grips so many people. And our comrade Yoad Ghanadri Hakim is the one who I really talk about it as gifting us this case. And it's through a process of sort of conversation. And when I was talking to her, and she really wanted Amjad, which is what is the name she gave him. It's a pseudonym. She really her work with Amjad changed her life. And so she was just like, I would love it if you could, narrate the story of Amjad. And I said, absolutely. And we translated it. She wrote it in Arabic and I translated it. And, but the story of Amjad is such a striking one, and it hits so many hearts. One, because it narrates the everyday condition of a Palestinian, and also everything we've been talking about, both in terms of from the side of the patient, but also from the side of the clinician. So Amjad is a man in his 30s who came in to work with Yoad, and he had been to a series of doctors for a choking sensation he felt in his throat and couldn't be explained medically. And so the doctors were just like, go and see a psychologist. And so he ends up going to see Yoad, who's Palestinian. And part of the reason he sees Yoad is because Palestinians are the ones who see Palestinian patients, because they're also Arabic speaking. Yoad is under supervision by a Zionist Jewish psychologist, because that's who supervises in the settler state, and this is in the context of Al-Quds. And so that's who supervises, and that's who gives you your license, and that's all of these things. So we're already in the complex matrix of, okay, there's a lot of stuff going on before we even get into the case, right? So Amjad starts coming in and explaining to Yoad that there's a lump in his throat and it makes it really hard for him to breathe. And Yoad starts quite slowly with him and sort of starts to narrate how, as a therapist, as a Palestinian therapist, she's feeling like he's saying a lot of words, but not really saying much of anything. And this is, by the way, to speak to psychoanalysis, like Zena was asking before, this is a technical, like she's technically attuned and an excellent therapist, technically, psychoanalytically, because you're trained to pay attention to sensations that you might feel that are not stated, that give you clues about what might be unsaid, unconsciously or not. And so she's coming to supervision saying, there's all these things I'm feeling. And the supervisor is insistent that nothing is happening. She keeps telling Yoad, no, he's just, has anxiety. That's all he's worried about. And Yoad narrates how she associates to, this was a game of negotiations. And she says, what a surprise that I'm, as a Palestinian, I'm thinking about this word negotiation. So there's something here that's very specific. Over the course of their work together, she starts asking him about when the ball comes up more. And he starts to tell her, I start to feel it when I'm angry, when I'm driving this shitty car of mine, when my wife nags me, when I drive by my closed house in the West Bank, when my Israeli boss asks me to bring olive oil from our lands to him. So he starts to narrate all these times when the ball gets more. And as he's narrating, he's like breathing really deeply. And so Yoad is like staying very close to this with him. And they met for a course of a year and a half. And somewhere along the way, when she starts to tell us, I start to feel we're getting past the symptoms here, which is really part of what, oftentimes patients will come in and maybe they just share the symptoms. And then as you build a relationship, there's much more that the symptoms represent. And at this point in time, the supervisor, who's also a psychoanalyst, tells her, it's time to quit, to terminate this therapy. He's done enough growth. He's fine. He's not feeling as anxious anymore. So there's no need to work anymore. Yoad, because this is her supervisor, feels pressured because she's just like, I have to listen to my supervisor. This is the person that like evaluates me, but I really don't think I should do this. But she ends up following through on this recommendation and comes in and tells Amjad, we need to stop therapy now because my supervisor thinks that everything's okay. And so this man, who's very quiet and very careful about his words, blows up on her and says something to them. I'm paraphrasing here, but I've read this enough times, or I know, it's like, you are not the arbiter of when somebody needs to stop, and you are not helping anybody. You don't get to decide. And you say you're a helper, but you don't get to decide when things are done. And Yoad narrates to us that in that moment, she feels exhilarated that this man who otherwise was so suppressed finally is able to express to her what's happening. And she makes a decision then to stop supervision, to stay seeing Amjad, but to stop supervision, because she realizes that there is no way the supervisor can actually attend to the complexities and the nuances of this person, because she will always miss seeing him. She will miss Amjad. One of the things that we talked to her about, and she agreed, is our reading that, if the supervisor allowed the therapy to continue and Amjad was able to speak, Amjad would be a speaking subject that spoke to the reality of what it is to be a Palestinian. And that supervisor could not handle it. And so she had to shut this shit down. This is the way, and using psychoanalysis doesn't go just one direction, right? We can read this and be like, you were too scared to have a speaking Palestinian, a man who actually didn't fit the bill of your stereotypes of an aggressor and, all these racist stereotypes. To the contrary, he was extremely soft-spoken and all of that. And so Yoad makes this decision, and we read that decision as an actually ethically attuned decision and one of willful defiance, in which she realizes if my responsibility actually is to my patient, because that's what our responsibility is, I cannot continue with this supervisor. And the beauty that comes from that is there's a shift in the work that happens, and things happen unconsciously. Like maybe Amjad actually felt that there was a shift in the way that Yoad was listening and being present with him, because she didn't have this racist supervisor she constantly had to subject herself to, or somebody who thought Amjad was just a behavioral being that, like, once you fix them behaviorally, nothing else is there. He didn't have an internal world. And so at one point she asks him, he says, I'm always so angry, right? I get so angry. And she says to him, who are you angry with? And he says, I'm angry with myself. Which is a moment where I think people are primed to think he was going to say Zionists or Israelis. And he actually says, I'm angry with myself. And then he proceeds to tell her a story of several years prior when he was driving his daughter, who's a 9-year-old daughter, and she was so excited about going to play with a friend in Al-Quds. And she got dressed up and put flowers in her hair. And she was singing a song about a ball jumping over a fence. And she, was just so excited to go with him. So the next day he takes her. And as soon as they got to the Qalandia checkpoint, it closed down because of, shooting that was happening, or like fights that were happening at the time. And there was a huge backup of traffic and they couldn't move. Right. And so this girl wasn't able to go play, which is, again, goes back to this idea of how things can shift so quickly. And it lasted about 15 minutes or so. But during this time, this 9-year-old girl needs to use the bathroom. And so she starts telling her Baba that she needs to use the bathroom. And he said, I don't think they're going to let us do it. But she was in a lot of pain trying to hold it in. So he gets out of the car to try to wave down a settler soldier, and he says to them, my daughter needs to go to the bathroom. And they draw their weapons on him, and they say, get back in the car. And he was just like, it's not for me, my daughter, she needs to pee. And they basically tell him, get back in the car and tell your daughter to piss herself. So he gets in the car and tells his daughter, it's okay, Baba, you can do it here. And then he remembers smelling urine in the car. And as they're driving away, he sees the checkpoint wall, the apartheid wall. And he remembers his daughter's song is Tabi Tabi Nutti Fawq al-Bawabi. And then he feels a ball in his throat. Right?
Wow. I don't even know, honestly, there's so much to dissect and discuss and process in all of it, because it's not theoretical, it's very much human, and it's not a topic of like political discussion. It's really a fundamental, basic experience of humanity, and experiencing childhood in a way that we don't think is traumatic, but it really is for everyone involved, even for us listening to the story. In a way, we see our
And go ahead.
Now, are these therapists in, let's just call it the Zionist state, are they training these soldiers to use these mechanisms?
The Israeli therapists?
Yes.
Conceivably, yeah. There are military psychologists that do these sorts of things.
So do you think though that they're saying, hey, here are some tips and tricks to really get to them or to break them down mentally, physically, or emotionally?
Oh, we know that for a fact, that psychologists are a part of that all over the world. Yeah, that sort of work, definitely. I mean, we know that with Guantanamo Bay, for example, of enhanced interrogation techniques, aka terrorizing somebody and torturing them. So yeah, psychology, that's what I mean by like psychology has been intimately involved with the state in doing this. And so why wouldn't the Zionist state be doing that as well? I don't think that lay psychologists, like I'm talking about, they might not be intimately involved, but there are absolutely psychologists involved with military training and interrogation and torture techniques that will say, this is what you do, this is what you say. We know that for a fact that they did this in Iraq, and they do this in Palestine, where they will say, we killed your father or we killed your kid or something like that. That sort of psyops is meant to break people. And that is very much the job of a psychologist, to say this is the sort of stuff that will, and like learn the weakness of somebody and sadistically use that.
So I asked that question to say, or really ask the next question is, what's happening to these individuals invoking these practices? Their soul, their heart, their mental health. I mean, this is just not normal, right?
Well, it's ideology. And I'll say that truly, because if you're a Zionist and you subscribe wholeheartedly to the ideology of Zionism, the ideology of Zionism is fundamentally one that is based on a racial supremacy that includes the dehumanization of indigenous people. In this case, it's Palestinians in every way. So to remain coherent in your dedication to this ideology, you have to keep repeating. Like we don't just like half-ass ideology. We're just like, today I'm this and today I'm this. It's like, no, there's a dedication that happens, which of course in the settler state is supported by everything, by all the state measures, by sort of forced conscription into the army, by all these sorts of things, by the normalization of violence, by the normalization of the settler state, by making it seem that Palestinians are the ones that are violent. All these sorts of things work together to support that ideology. It's not so much, like this has happened to them. It's more so that they are dedicated to an ideology that there's no way you can get around that. Like, that's what this ideology means. That's why Zionism is racism is a great way to think about that. And if you're a white supremacist and you're dedicated to white supremacy, there's no way, there's all these things that you have to do to continue to make that coherent for you. And I think over time, so people who are engaged in this are just like, I am doing this for this reason, right? And because, let's say, these are security threats to the Zionist state, or these people are human animals, or these people don't deserve empathy, or every kid ends up being a terrorist. All the shit that we've heard for ages, but has been, galvanized in the last year. That's the sort of stuff that's happening. And just to sort of with this Amjad case is to see how, Nader Shalhoub-Kavarkan talks about unchilding, and Abir Uthman talks about unfathering. And in Amjad's case, you see both of these things happening. And on the one hand, this child, the unchilding is using children as political capital, that in this moment, that the most normative day in a child's life, you're going to play with your friend. And you not only have to stop at a checkpoint, but the level of violence, of violation, of making you wet yourself and have to sit with that, right? And then the unfathering part is also attempting to break the ability of that father in that moment to protect their child from this violence that becomes part of the Zionist regime. But I want to say something also more to this. It's not just about unfathering. This is the defiance part, is in that even though it's circumscribed by violence, just like we're seeing in Gaza, it also flies in the face of every racist trope about Palestinian men and fathers. Because here's a man who leaned in to his 9-year-old daughter and hugged her as she cried, and she peed herself, and he sat there with her. And this is what we're seeing in Gaza every single day, right? Is these fathers with such tenderness and love and expansiveness. And I'm not saying that because I'm surprised. I'm saying that because I want to underscore that. And that's part of the things that happen to these people, is also training people unconsciously to socially reproduce, trainees, psychologists, to not see those things. That supervisor could not see Amjad as a caring father. She could only see him as a behavioral being that either fit her idea because she is ideologically committed to Zionism. Not because she's a bad therapist or any one of these things. It's because she chooses Zionism. And if you choose Zionism, Palestinians can't be indigenous, Palestinians can't be human, Palestinians can't be good fathers, and all the rest of it. There's a choice you're making psychologically.
We're speaking about Palestinians, of course. This applies to Lebanese and Yemenis and Sudan and Congo. I mean, anywhere where there's such deep intrusion on the humanity of a people. And we talk about that in the context of those people in particular while they're living there, sort of that trauma that they're, or and I don't want to keep saying trauma, but the experience that they're feeling, what they're going through, particularly the unchilding. Actually, you said that, you talked to us about that once before, and it stuck with me. But that whole concept of sort of there versus here, we continuously, rightfully discuss the mental health of the people going through colonization on the ground. But then there's all of us that have to watch this and try everything we can for now 13 months and, plus 76 years to live through it, for one thing, to watch it and watch our people being slaughtered, but also to have to defend ourselves, for example, taking it politically, to justifying not voting for it, for example, right? Or to having to apologize for, Can you talk a little bit about the distinction, or maybe even for those of us on the outside, what do you see? How do you see this manifesting? What are you seeing overall?
Yeah, the psychological parts of it specifically.
Yes.
Yeah. I think there's a way in which people, number one, the most thing I've heard, honestly, is people feel, and these are their words, I feel like I'm going crazy, right? I hear this over and over and over again. And part of that, and this is why over the past year, I've been like honing in and really thinking about this idea of psychic intrusion and psyops a lot more. And like, how is it that people who are watching something and know what they are seeing come to think that they are the ones that are crazy, not the situation? And, there's a complexity of reasons around that. But if something is over and over and over again messaging you that you are the one that is, off about this, like the justifying the vote, there's a way in which, again, because systems of oppression and power and settler colonial logics discipline us in ways in which we bend reality. Right? Those of us live in the settler colony of the United States are used to waking up every single day and using the colonial name for the places that we live. That is settler colonial reality bending, because we don't think about it. We're just like, this is this. And it's like, no, it's like the comparison of Palestine, of waking up and, calling places and villages by the name, but by what they are, not the colonial name. So I think there's a way in which people have been working really hard to maintain reality testing in the face of propaganda campaigns that would have us get confused, even though we know what we're seeing, right? The other part of it that I've heard is that people feeling guilty, especially those in diaspora, about like they're the ones paying the price and we're here, and we have a duty to defend in certain ways or fight in certain ways. And I think, one thing that I tell people often is that, yes, it's important to think about the differences in diaspora versus people on the ground. Absolutely. I'm somebody who lives in diaspora from Lebanon. It's not the same thing about living in Lebanon. However, I think it's also important for us to think about always historically locating what created a diaspora. In the context of Palestine, that's something very specific to come, is that it's the Nakba that created, by and large, the majority of diaspora. And this idea of like treating it as though it's the same, as that it's just like, oh, this is a choice that I made. Some people made that choice, just like any other immigrants. But if we're looking at like, most of those people also have a choice to go back. And that's just not the case in Palestine. And so locating ourselves in that reality actually helps. It might not relieve the guilt because you're still feeling it deeply, because people have ties to the land and family and everything. But it does locate the reasoning why somebody might not be there. You're not there because you were expelled, because your family was expelled, which is not the same as just like choosing, shrug, I'm just not there, right? There also is a way in which I hear people say, I don't feel like I'm doing enough, which I respect very much. There's something so deeply heartbreaking about witnessing from afar and feeling like we're not doing a lot. And then I did an online event with Wissam Rafidi, who wrote The Trinity of Fundamentals, and he was talking about, the Intifada, and he was it was with the National SJP. And he was speaking. I had this beautiful experience of like translating for him from Arabic to English in real time, which is a whole different experience of feeling the words, right? And he said to the students, he's like, all of you are so worried that you're not kind of measuring up to what we do on the ground. And I can't even tell you that you've gone above and beyond what we could have ever imagined, and you are part of Palestinian history now. And that just hit me so hard, of like the people that we are always imagining we're letting down are the people who most readily will be like, we couldn't have even imagined that this would happen, and that you are making us proud. And it's true, because there is a role to those of us in the heart of empire. And it's a different role. It's going to be different. And it's not going to look the same as on the ground. And it's not a replacement for resistance on the ground. But I think sometimes undermining that is one way we work through or negotiate the guilt of not being there. And I think that might not be a helpful place for us to be in, because that shores up the colonial logic that being at a distance dislocates us from the land. And it's like, no, it doesn't. The forced expulsion from the land doesn't mean I forget my land, doesn't mean I'm not connected to it. But in this place, in this locale, what am I fighting here? Right? And that's something to speak back to the things that I've been hearing people say. And I think when people are able to think about it in that way, there's some solace there. And then we are able to also see it as the same logic that repeats itself across space, right? That the settler colonial logic is in Palestine in a specific manifestation because of Zionism, but there's also the same logic here. And it's maybe a different angle, but it's the same logic, and that's how it works on us.
Yeah, and I mean, directly to that is your own experience at university. I mean, we don't have to go too far to see the suppression in the United States of talking about Palestine.
Yes.
What has been your experience with that?
Hypothetically.
Yeah. It's not even yeah. We joke, my partner and I always joke that we were like the OG doxing truck people, because now it's like, every other person, which is like, you can see the acceleration of Zionist machinery and supremacist machinery happen like post the Al-Aqsa flood, right? But for that to happen that quickly, the infrastructure had to exist. And so I'm like, this was like April, I want to say 2023 in New York. So in January 2023, Stand With Us, which is a, Zionist watchdog organization that loves Trump and works with Netanyahu and believes settlements should be legal and all this. They're an extremist organization. They filed a Title 6, not Title 9, a Title 6. So let's for the editor, let's say that, because very different two things. Okay. Stand With Us filed a Title 6 complaint against George Washington University, which was my former employer. And what they did was they released the filing to a right-wing rag, basically, the day before they filed it with the Department of Education. And they redacted everybody's name except mine. And so on the day of the filing, I woke up to a slew of hate mail and Zionist and otherwise racist, sexist, violent hate mail on every possible platform: Twitter, Instagram, emails, my personal email, my work email, phone calls to my employer. And this is astroturfing 101. Like, that's what they do, right? But it's telling, because it's sort of like redacting everybody's name but mine is also setting a target and saying, here's the person you go after, go get her, right? And releasing it to a right-wing rag. Like, if you really were worried about what you said you're worried about, why would you drag this and potentially also endanger the students that you so-called care about? Right. So that happened. And then it was a firestorm. And then Fox News picked it up because they love this shit. Right. And then they had a picture of me with a kufi headband next to like Islamic Jihad, and then randomly down the script you see just like an explosion somewhere, like underneath it was sort of like Afghanistan or something, like, and not, but you can see the psychological elements of like association. I have a kufiya headband, therefore that's Islamic Jihad because they have a headband around here. Forget that it's like a different color, different place, like doesn't fucking matter, because the intent is to have Islamophobia do its job. And that's what I mean about the infrastructure of this. And that was the intent. The intent was to harass, to intimidate me, to send people after me. And that's precisely what happened. And honestly, these watchdog groups, right, these racist Zionist watchdog groups, their dream is for Fox News to pick this shit up. There are so many people they did this to where it didn't get there. For whatever reason, it did for me. And Fox News picked it up. And I think when I say for whatever reason, I've learned over over time that there were many connections to outside groups, including this one, morbidly obsessed academic who was responsible for Stephen Salaita's firing, that just gets obsessed with these things. And he's been, quote unquote, consulting with professional organizations that I'm with and contacting people and saying, this is how you do this. And then wrote a chapter about me. These people are like, he's a stalker, basically. And so it's all these things coming together and you start to see, right? So then this happens, and then antisemitism.org calls me the anti-Semite of the week, and then blast that out to hundreds of thousands of people. And then Canary Mission, puts my stuff on like 75 pages of shit. And what's really interesting is that it's not only like anti-Israel stuff. They start to put anti-Israel stuff, anti-USA, anti-cop, right? So all of a sudden they're mobilizing like Americans' worst nightmare is a communist, anti-capitalist, cop-hating Arab. And that's all you need to do for shit to get really dark. Forced deportation, threats of rape, writing my husband and telling him to discipline me, like with like sexual innuendo, but also discipline me. Like, these are the people who like hate Arabs because supposedly Arabs are anti-women. And then they're saying you need to discipline your bitch. Like, you can't make sense of it because it's just racist. Things that now we are probably more accustomed to, where they'd say like, I hope Palestine is turned into a parking lot, get the fuck out of here, calling me a sand N-word, you don't belong here, and we're coming after you. I got old school snail mail of like cutouts from like a magazine, like the shit you see on TV, where you have people like take time to cut out things. So it's like sociopath style. And they sent it, and the return address was Rashida Tlaib's address. Right? So it's this, like, it's like a federal offense. You're sending fucking hate, like, and you're using Rashida Tlaib's. So all of this stuff starts to happen. And of course, calls to fire me, calls to cancel all my talks. It moved really viciously and very quickly. And the thing that really, isolated me further, or was meant to isolate me further, because I'm not letting those motherfuckers have anything. I had a lot of love and a lot of solidarity. So I did not feel isolated in this. But their intent was to do that. And so I believe there was pressure on the university, which now we have seen. This is not specific to my former employer. This is how universities work, right? What they did was they preempted the Department of Education, which is the only body that could adjudicate this Title, 6 claim. And they hired an outside investigator to look into these claims, which was unheard of at the time. Now we've seen this happen many times. But at the time, it was unheard of. It was like, why would you spend so much money when Department of Education has a process already to do this? And they hired a firm, and that's when the ADC stepped in. And I owe everything to the ADC and their incredible advocacy for me. And they stepped in and represented me. And they hired this firm that had, when we looked into it, had a Israel sort of branch that talked about like anti-boycott legislation and all this stuff. So we were like, this is seriously fucked. This is not good. So thank God for Abed and his movement to sort of protect me and because all the Zionists were like, this is a sham investigation. And we're sitting there thinking like, this is a sham investigation because I'm going to get fucked no matter what. It went through the process. And on March 27th, 2023, I was not only cleared of every single point that was in that, horribly written and sloppy filing, but also the investigator, because there were, and they interviewed everybody, every student that was in the class, they interviewed faculty, everybody, and they could not find one thing that was true about these claims, because it wasn't, which is what I was saying all along. I'm like, thanks guys for telling me exactly what I said, plus 200 pages of documentation for it. But it also went on to say that collapsing anti-Zionism with anti-Semitism goes against academic freedom. And this is the first time that we have like a document from an outside independent party saying that. But surprise, that didn't matter to the Zionists. Like, then it became GW is like faking this and they won't release the results. And this was their own. I mean, this, which just shows you, all of this to say is honesty and truth is not ever the point. The point is to create a controversy, to try to isolate people. And of course, if you have an Arab and an Arab woman, I do think this had something to do with it. They assumed, here's an Arab woman. She's an assistant professor. It's easy to attack her. We can get a win out of this. And they got something else coming to them instead of that. But that really is part of it. So it's kind of arbitrary. But right after that, I think a couple weeks later, that's the OG truck, as Stephen and I were in New York for a conference, a psychology conference in New York on 6th Avenue. And this truck's out there with both of our faces. And I maintain this is sexist because his photo was so nice and mine was a shit photo. But it's ones with the kafiyeh. And it was said, why is the American Psychological Association hosting anti-Semites? And it was circling the conference venue for 2 days. The New York Post was there. They accosted me. They tried to coerce me to say something. There had to be like people who were like going to and from places with me, buddying up, because we didn't know what type of fascist was going to show up. They did the same thing again in May. I wasn't on campus that spring semester, but when I did go on campus to graduate my students, this truck showed up again, and they knew exactly what building I was in and where our building for my program was in, which is actually not a very, markable place because we have a clinic that's there. And so it's not really made public. So somebody had to tell them. What's his name? David Horowitz's foundation spread like 5,000 newspapers with the top anti-Semitic, professors in the world or something ridiculous. Their stupid, pathetic attempts at this. And I was number 3, and I think Rabab was number 1 or something like that. It's the same shit over and over and over again. So this is what we live in. Like I said, now this stuff is regularized. We look at it and we're like, this is why we were sounding the alarm. This is why the ADC came in hard and said, this is a chilling effect and we need to be careful because this shit sets a precedent. And it did. It did set a precedent. And truth didn't fucking matter. Right? As over and over and over again. I mean, the harassment that I got both from in the field and outside, with no regard to truth, to testimony, to students who were there, to Jewish students who were like, this is bullshit. It did not matter. And now we're seeing the extension of that, right? So it just shows you like this idea of caving to outside pressure. And this is what I think we need to sort of be very specific about, is that does this have the flavor certainly of Zionism? And absolutely. But we need to also think about where Zionism fits in the larger framework of this. And these sorts of external right-wing political forces and organizations have been trying to rewire and reconfigure higher education and campuses for a long, long time. And what the liberals have allowed to do is they've joined forces with fascists because of Palestine, and now have opened the door for this to happen. And only Palestine could be. They've been trying this for ages and they didn't win. But when Palestine is the entry point, then you have administrators caving. And let's also be specific, it's because Palestine speaks to everything else, and administrators aren't going to come up against the troublemakers about labor directly because they might get shit on for that. But you can use Palestine as an excuse to discipline that, because everybody who cares about labor cares about Palestine. Everybody who cares about reproductive rights and trans and queer issues also cares about Palestine. Everybody who cares about critical race theory cares about Palestine. Guess what's the easiest way to have right-wing control of higher education, as they've wanted to for a long time? And liberals, as they usually do, are able to give up everything when their ideological positions are threatened in any way, shape, or form. And Zionism is one of those. And so they've now joined forces, and it's not going to stop at Palestine. What a surprise. But that's the place we're at.
I'm going to be honest with you. When I heard the whole story with what happened at GW, the only thing that came to mind was you're the walking definition of F around and find out. No joke. How you went through it, how you fought back, kudos to you.
Thank you.
You stood up to the bully, and you still are standing up to the bullies. Yeah. So good for you.
Thank you. Wouldn't have it any other way.
There we go. So you have a book coming out soon? Are you still working on it?
Yes, I am working on it. It's been hard to write, as you can imagine. I'm doing it, but it's been a tough year to organize one's thoughts and stuff. But yeah, I do have it coming out.
It's From the Clinic to the Street, Psychoanalysis, right?
For Revolutionary Futures.
Yep.
Yes, Pluto.
In a year, 2 years?
I'm hoping within the year.
Okay.
Yes.
Excellent. Well, we appreciate you coming on. Any final words to the audience or anybody who may be struggling with everything that they're watching on TV or listening to?
Yeah. The world has changed, folks. That's what I would say. And lean into that. Like, it's new possibilities are here. And I think sometimes we regularize it so quickly that it might take time for us to actually see how much has shifted. And it's shifted because people have been working on shifting it for decades, not just this last year. And so I would say, like, I always tell people, just resist the commodification of your despair. Like, if you're feeling despair, that's a moment for us to sort of think and be like, who does this support? What does it shore up? And, for us seeing kufiyas everywhere, it can regularize very quickly. And then we can think about, fuck, man, there are kufiyas everywhere. And if that disrupts one settler's day, that's a good thing, man. Wear your kufiya with pride.
And one last point really quick. I wanted to congratulate you. You officially broke the number of curse words on this podcast. So thank you.
A high tradition. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Laura. Yes. We appreciate it.
Lara, thank you for being with us, and hopefully many more to come.
Thank you. Yatikun al-Fafi. Thank you so much.
Listen, stay tuned, because it's time for Sumud.